to Strange Epochs. I'm Shawn Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. Last week, we were in the streets of Strasbourg in 1518, watching a woman dance herself to the edge of death and watching hundreds of others follow her. This week, we are going somewhere darker. We are going to Rome. The year is 897. The Catholic Church is in crisis. And inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the most important church in Christendom, something is happening that has no precedent in the history of the institution and that will never be repeated again. A dead man is being put on trial. Not metaphorically, not in absentia. His body 9 months in the grave has been dug up, dressed in the full vestments of the papacy, and seated on a throne in a court of law. Bishops and priests and powerful men sit in rows before him. A prosecutor paces the floor. A defense lawyer, a terrified young deacon who has been assigned this impossible job, stands to one side, trying to find words. And the man on the throne, the accused, the former Pope Formosus, says nothing, because he is a corpse. This is the Cadaver Synod, and it really happened. New episodes every Tuesday at 5 in the morning. Sources are always in the episode description. Let's begin. Rome, January 897. The Basilica of St. John Lateran stands at the edge of the city, massive and ancient, its walls holding centuries of memory. St. Peter's not the famous basilica on the hill that most people picture when they think of Rome. St. John Lateran is older. It is the official seat of the Bishop of Rome, the cathedral church of the Pope himself, and on this January morning, it is full. The men inside are dressed in the robes of their offices. Bishops, priests, deacons, members of the Roman nobility. They have been summoned here by Pope Stephen VI, and they have come, some eagerly, some reluctantly, some with the careful, blank expression of men who have learned that survival in 9th century Rome requires keeping your opinions to yourself. At the front of the room, on the papal throne, sits a figure in white and gold vestments. The figure does not move. The figure does not breathe. What sits on the throne of the most powerful religious office in the Western world is the exhumed body of Pope Formosus, dead for 9 months, dressed in the full regalia of the papacy, propped upright by attendants who stand on either side of him like grim statues. His face, what remains of his face, stares forward. His hands rest in his lap. One of those hands, the right one, still bears the 3 fingers he used in life to bestow blessings on the faithful. For now, Pope Stephen VI stands before the assembly. He is a small man, by some accounts, but today he seems to fill the room. His face is flushed. His eyes are bright with something that the men watching him will later describe in hushed and careful tones as madness. He turns to the corpse on the throne and begins to speak. His voice rises. He is screaming at a dead man. And the dead man, as the whole room watches in silent horror, says nothing at all. Act 1. The world that made this possible. To understand the Cadaver Synod, you have to understand what the papacy was in the 9th century. And what it was, to be direct about it, was a prize. We tend to think of the Catholic Church as a monolithic institution, ancient, hierarchical, slow-moving, larger than any individual. And in many ways, across many centuries, that is accurate. But in the 9th century, particularly in the final decades of that century, The church, and specifically the office of the Pope, was anything but stable. It was a battleground. To understand why, you have to go back a little further. For most of the 8th and early 9th centuries, the papacy had existed in a relatively comfortable partnership with the Carolingian dynasty, the great Frankish ruling family that had produced Charlemagne, the king who became the first Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800. This partnership worked because both sides needed each other. The popes needed the military protection of the Carolingian emperors, who could defend Rome against its many enemies. The emperors needed the religious legitimacy that only the pope could provide. The act of crowning, the laying on of hands, the declaration that your rule was sanctioned by God. You scratch my back, I crown yours. But by the middle of the 9th century, the Carolingian Empire was fracturing. Charlemagne's descendants were dividing the empire among themselves, fighting each other for territory, producing a succession of weak and ineffective rulers. And as the empire weakened, the protection it offered to Rome weakened with it. Into that vacuum stepped the great Roman noble families. These were old, powerful, deeply rooted clans who had been building influence in the city for generations. They controlled land, they controlled militia, they controlled the networks of patronage and obligation that held Roman society together. And they looked at the office of the Pope, the most powerful religious position in the Western world, the man who could crown emperors, the guardian of the tomb of St. Peter, and they saw something worth having. So they reached out and took it. In the years between 872 and 965 is a period of less than a century. There were 24 popes. Let that sink in for a moment. 24 men occupied the papal throne in less than 100 years. By comparison, in the entire 20th century, there were only 9. Some of these 9th century popes reigned for years and died of natural causes. Others lasted months. A few lasted weeks. Several were deposed. Several were imprisoned. Several were murdered. One was allegedly smothered with a pillow. The chair of St. Peter, as one historian of the period put it, had become less a throne than a target. And behind almost every deposition, every imprisonment, every suspicious death, were the Roman noble families, maneuvering their candidates into position and eliminating their rivals by whatever means were available. This was the world into which Pope Formosus was born, and it was the world that eventually consumed him, not in life, but afterward, in a way that no one, even in that brutal age, had anticipated. Formosus was born around 816. We do not know the exact date, into a Roman family of modest but respectable standing. He entered the church as a young man and rose through its ranks with impressive speed, becoming a bishop in his 40s and attracting the attention of successive popes who valued his intelligence and his political instincts. He was, by all accounts, genuinely gifted. He was a skilled diplomat. He was deeply interested in the expansion of Christianity into new territories. He led a mission to Bulgaria in the 860s that nearly made him a bishop there, which would matter enormously to the story we are telling. He was learned, politically shrewd, and ambitious in the way that the church of that era almost required its leaders to be. He was also, throughout his career, relentlessly controversial. His troubles began in earnest with Pope John VIII, who ruled the papacy from 872 to 882, and who viewed Formosus with deep suspicion. John accused Formosus of plotting to become pope himself, ambition that violated the norms of the church, which held that a bishop who coveted the papacy was disqualifying himself from it. He excommunicated Formosus and forced him into exile. extracting from him an oath that he would never return to Rome and would never again seek ecclesiastical office. Formosus spent years in exile, and then John VIII was murdered, poisoned first, then bludgeoned to death when the poison worked too slowly, making him the first pope to be assassinated, and with his patron gone, Formosus gradually worked his way back. His excommunication was lifted. He was restored to his diocese at Porto. He bided his time, and in 891 he was elected pope. His papacy lasted 5 years. 5 years of constant political turbulence, of playing the great powers of Italy against each other, of making alliances and breaking them, of trying to hold together a church and a city that were both coming apart at the seams. He crowned 2 men as Holy Roman Emperor in those 5 years, which tells you something about the instability of the office he was crowning. The first was Lambert of Spoleto, the son of a powerful Italian duke. The second was Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king whom Formosus invited into Italy specifically to counter Lambert's growing power. This decision to invite Arnulf, to crown Arnulf, to play the Franks against the Spartans, would have consequences that outlasted Formosus's life. He died on the 4th of April, 896. The cause of death is not recorded with certainty. He was old, perhaps 80 years old, perhaps older, and the years of struggle had worn him down. He died in his bed, which was more than many of his contemporaries managed, and he was buried in St. Peter's Basilica with the honors due a pope. He was in the ground for 9 months when they came to dig him up. Act 2. The Synodus Horrenda. After Formosus died, the papacy went through 2 more popes in rapid succession. Boniface VI lasted 15 days, and then Stephen VI was elected, with the strong backing of Lambert of Spoleto and his mother Angeltrude, the empress, who had returned to Rome and resumed their dominance over the city. Stephen was, in the accounts that survive, an unstable man. Whether his instability preceded his papacy or was a product of it, of the enormous pressures and dangers of the office, of the constant threat of deposition, or worse, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is what he did. He ordered the exhumation of Pope Formosus. The official reason the charge that would be brought at the trial was canonical. Formosus, Stephen argued, had violated church law when he became pope. Specifically, he had been the Bishop of Porto before his election to the papacy, and church law strictly forbade the translation of a bishop from one see to another. A bishop, once consecrated to a particular diocese, was bound to it. To leave Porto and become the Bishop of Rome, which is what the title of Pope technically means, was a violation of the oath he had sworn. There were other charges too: perjury, specifically the oath he had broken when he returned from exile, after promising never to return; the old accusations about coveting the papacy; a general charge of having acted improperly throughout his career. But beneath the canonical language, the real motivation was political. If Formosus's papacy could be declared null and void, if his time as pope could be retroactively erased, then everything he had done as pope was also erased. Every ordination he had performed, every appointment he had made, every crowning, including, crucially, his crowning of Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor, and also including, possibly, his appointment of Stephen himself as a bishop, which meant that Stephen may have been motivated not just by the loyalty to Lambert, but by a desire to legitimize his own position. If Formosus had never legally been pope, then Formosus's appointment of Stephen as Bishop of Anagni was also void, which paradoxically solved the same canonical problem that Stephen was accusing Formosus of. Stephen, too, Was a bishop being asked to hold another office? By nullifying Formosus, he could erase the problem. It was, in its way, a remarkably convoluted piece of political logic. The body was exhumed in January of 897. We do not have a precise date. We do not have a detailed account of the exhumation itself, of who gave the orders, who carried them out, what the men who opened the tomb found when they lifted the lid. 9 months in the ground in the 9th century, without embalming, in the heat of a Roman summer preceding a Roman winter. We can imagine what they found. We will leave the details to the imagination. The body was dressed in the full vestments of the papacy, white robes, the papal tiara, the vestments of a man at the height of his power. Attendants were assigned to hold the corpse upright on the throne, because it could not, of course, hold itself. And the trial began. The Basilica of St. John Lateran was full of men who did not want to be there. The bishops and priests and deacons who attended had been summoned by the Pope, and you did not refuse a summons from the Pope, not if you wanted to keep your position, your freedom, possibly your life. So they came, and they sat, and they watched. A young deacon, his name is not preserved in the historical record, had been assigned the role of defense counsel for the dead Pope. This was, as you might imagine, an essentially impossible job. He could not consult his client. He could not call witnesses on his client's behalf without risking Stephen's wrath. He had been handed a role in a play whose ending had already been written, and his job was simply to provide the appearance of a fair trial, while saying as little as possible that might land him in trouble. Contemporary accounts describe him as timid, frightened, barely audible, and Stephen VI was anything but quiet. The accounts of the trial, most of which were written years or decades later, which means they have the quality of legend as well as history, describe Stephen as frenzied, screaming, pacing, turning to the corpse on the throne and demanding answers with the full force of his voice and his fury. At one point, according to Liutprand of Cremona, one of our main sources, Stephen directly addressed the body, screaming at it, mocking it, asking why it had dared to usurp the papacy in such a spirit of ambition. The corpse, propped in its chair, said nothing. The assembled clergy watched in silence. What were they thinking? We can only imagine. Horror, almost certainly. Fear, for their own safety, for the safety of anyone who showed too much reaction in either direction. Perhaps something that wasn't quite disbelief, because they lived in a world where the dead were not entirely absent, where bodies had power, where the question of what happened to a man's soul after death was not abstract theology, but urgent, present reality, and perhaps, for some of them, a grim fascination with what they were witnessing. The verdict was never in doubt. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. His papacy was declared null and void. Every act he had performed as pope, every ordination, every appointment, every crowning was retroactively erased. The bishops and priests he had ordained were ordered to be reordained because their original ordinations were now legally meaningless. And then came the punishment. The vestments were stripped from the body. The white robes, the tiara, the symbols of papal authority, all torn away. In their place, the corpse was dressed in the plain clothes of a layman, a common man, a nobody. Then the 3 fingers of the right hand, the fingers of benediction, the fingers with which Formosus had blessed the faithful for years, with which he had crowned emperors, were cut off. The body was dragged across the floor of the basilica, and then it was taken to the Tiber River and thrown in. According to the Annales Alemannici, one of the contemporary chronicles that recorded these events, blood was flowing from the corpse's mouth as it was dragged through the basilica. This detail may be literal, may be metaphorical, may be the kind of embellishment that grows in the telling. But it captures something true about the atmosphere of that day, that what happened in the Basilica of St. John Lateran in January of 897 was not a legal proceeding. It was a desecration. Act 3. Aftermath, the body in the river, and what came after. The people of Rome watched what happened to the body of Formosus, and they were horrified. It is worth pausing on that, because it is easy to assume that medieval people were simply accustomed to violence and brutality in ways that we are not. And it is true that life in 9th century Rome was harder and death more visible than most of us in the modern world can easily imagine. But the people of Rome had a deep and specific reverence for the dead, particularly for the bodies of popes, who were not merely men but the earthly representatives of God, whose tombs were sacred, whose relics were venerated, whose burial place in St. Peter's Basilica was one of the holiest sites in Christendom. What Stephen had done was not just politically questionable, it was an act of profound sacrilege, and the Romans felt it as such. The body of Formosus did not stay in the Tiber. Accounts differ on who retrieved it. Some say it was monks who lived along the river and pulled it from the water when it washed ashore. Some say it was fishermen. Some say it was ordinary Romans who had recognized what the body was and felt compelled to treat it with the dignity that Stephen had denied it. Whatever the specifics, the body was recovered, and rumors began to spread almost immediately. Rumors that the waterlogged, mutilated corpse of Pope Formosus was performing miracles, that the sick who came near it were healed, that it was incorrupt or partly incorrupt, which in the medieval understanding of sanctity was a sign of God's favor. Whether any of this was literally true matters less than what it tells us about the mood of the city. Rome was turning against Stephen. The Cadaver Synod had been a spectacle too far. The Roman people, already living under the thumb of the Spolitan faction that backed Stephen, found in this event a focal point for their outrage. The trial had not just offended religious sensibility, it had threatened the entire structure of clerical legitimacy. If Formosus's ordinations were void, then the ordinations of every priest and bishop he had consecrated were also void, and the ordinations of every priest ordained by those bishops might be void. The theological and administrative implications spread outward like cracks in stone, threatening to undermine the validity of sacraments across much of Christendom. People were asking, if my priest was ordained by a bishop, ordained by Formosus, is my confession valid? Is my marriage? Is my baptism? These were not abstract questions in a world where the sacraments were understood as the literal mechanisms of salvation. Stephen was deposed. The accounts are not entirely clear on the mechanics, whether it was a popular uprising, a coup by rival noble factions, or some combination of both. But he was removed from the papal throne, stripped of his vestments, and thrown into prison. He was strangled to death in his cell in July or August of 897. He had been pope for a little over a year. The popes who followed moved quickly to undo what Stephen had done. Pope Theodore II, who reigned for only 20 days, one of the shortest pontificates in history, nevertheless managed, in those 20 days, to convene a synod that annulled the Cadaver Synod entirely and ordered that the body of Formosus be recovered from wherever it now rested and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica in the full vestments of the papacy, with the honors due a pope. Pope John IX, who followed Theodore, went further. He convened two synods, one in Rome, one in Ravenna, that not only nullified the Cadaver Synod but banned the practice entirely. No future trial of a dead person would be permitted. The records of the Cadaver Synod itself were ordered destroyed. The document that had declared Formosus guilty was sought out and burned. And yet, in 904, Pope Sergius III, who had himself been present at the Cadaver Synod as a bishop and had supported Stephen, returned to power and immediately reversed everything. He redeclared the Cadaver Synod valid. He renullified Formosus's papacy. He ordered yet again that the ordinations of Formosus were void. The body of Formosus, which had been reburied with dignity in St. Peter's, was reportedly exhumed again by Sergius's order, though this second exhumation is less well documented and may be legendary. What is certain is that the rehabilitation of Formosus's reputation was officially reversed. And then Sergius died, and his successors rehabilitated Formosus again. The pendulum swung back and forth for years, following the political winds of the papacy, until the question of Formosus gradually faded from urgent controversy to historical curiosity. What does it mean? Historians have spent a long time arguing about the Cadaver Synod, about what it tells us about Stephen's mental state, about the politics of the Spolitan faction, about the nature of power and legitimacy in the early medieval church. And those arguments are interesting and worth having. But I think the most interesting thing about the Cadaver Synod is what it tells us about the power of bodies. In the 9th century and in much of the medieval period more broadly, a body was not simply the remains of a person. It was still, in some sense, the person. The saints were present in their relics. The dead were accessible through prayer at their tombs. A pope's body was not merely symbolic, it was a continuing locus of his authority, his holiness, his connection to God. Stephen understood this. That is why he dug Formosus up. The trial was not simply legal theater. It was an attempt to destroy Formosus's power in the only way that power could be destroyed, by physically degrading the body that still carried it, by stripping the vestments, by cutting off the blessing fingers, by throwing the body into the river so it could not be venerated, could not become a shrine, could not continue to exist as a sacred object in the landscape of the city. He was trying to kill a dead man. And in a sense, he failed, because the body was recovered, because the miracles were reported, because the people of Rome decided, in the face of what they had witnessed, that Formosus was more sacred in his degradation than Stephen was in his power. The Cadaver Synod was never repeated. The Church had looked at what happened in January of 897 and decided, collectively, that some lines should not be crossed. Even in the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark century, as historians call this period, the century of violence and intrigue and rapid-fire popes, there were limits. This was one of them. We don't know what it felt like to be in that basilica, to be one of the terrified bishops in the rows of seats, watching a screaming pope hurl accusations at a corpse, to be the young deacon assigned to defend the indefensible, standing with his notes and his carefully prepared arguments before a dead man who could not use them. We don't know what it felt like to be the men who pulled the body of Formosus from the Tiber, whether they were moved by piety, by outrage, by fear, or by some mixture of all three that we don't have a word for. We know only that it happened, that in the winter of 897, in the most sacred building in the Western world, the living put the dead on trial and found them guilty, and that the dead, in their way, won anyway. That's what strange epochs is. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail, drawn from documented historical sources, All of the sources are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Shawn Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.